All right, today we're jumping into a really big, complex idea: atonement. We're going to break down one specific theological perspective that views it as this incredibly detailed, divine plan, a plan to fix what it describes as a fundamentally broken relationship between God and humanity. So let's get right into it.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we have to understand the problem, this broken relationship. Then, we'll define what atonement actually is. After that, we'll walk through the divine plan, the really specific two-part sacrifice at its core. And finally, the ultimate goal, reconciliation.
Okay, so first things first. Before you can really get your head around the solution, you've got to understand the problem it's supposed to fix. And at the very heart of this theological argument is this idea of a deep, fundamental separation between people and God.
And you know, this quote right here from the book of Isaiah is used all over the source material we're looking at. It really sets the stage perfectly. It paints this powerful picture of a silent, willing sacrifice. And that image is absolutely central to the whole concept of atonement we're unpacking today.
The source traces this whole problem all the way back to the very beginning, to Adam and Eve. The argument here is that their disobedience wasn't just some small mistake. It was an act that fundamentally shattered the relationship, creating this kind of spiritual conflict that just had to be resolved.
So that brings us to the big word here, atonement. Everything we're talking about is built around this single concept. But what does it actually mean, especially in this context?
Well, according to the source, atonement boils down to three key actions: to appease, to compensate, and to cover. Think of it as a single act that is designed to satisfy anger, pay back a wrong, and completely cover a debt. It's all about bringing total and complete resolution. Now, to make this idea really hit home, the source material uses a pretty intense analogy. It compares atonement to the feeling of winning a retaliatory war. The idea is that for the party that was wronged, getting that decisive victory brings this incredibly deep sense of satisfaction and justice being restored. It's a really stark image, meant to show just how powerfully this theology believes the cosmic scales were balanced. All right, so we've got a broken relationship and a need for atonement. The story now shifts to the solution. And according to this source, this wasn't some plan B. It was a pre-existing divine plan put in motion.
And this is a really crucial point in the text. This whole thing is framed as a proactive plan that's driven by love. The end goal wasn't to punish, but to save. And the method for that was something very specific, what's called a sin offering, where God's own Son would become the very sacrifice required to fix everything. So what exactly did this plan have to achieve? I mean, if you look at the goals, you can see how they're all connected. First, you need someone to stand in the middle, a mediator. But that mediator also has to provide a sacrifice that's big enough to satisfy divine justice, what the text calls righteous wrath. It's only after that happens that the path is finally cleared for a restored relationship.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of how this atonement actually worked, because the source material is super specific about this. It describes the sacrifices happening in two separate but totally essential parts.
So here's the absolute critical point. It's a two-step process. Step one is the baptism by John. In this view, this is the exact moment Jesus legally takes all the sins of humanity onto himself. Step two is the crucifixion. That's where the penalty for all those sins is actually paid, through the shedding of his blood. So one act takes on the debt, and the second act pays it off. The source brings up this quote from the Gospel of Matthew to really drive home why that first step was so necessary. You see, when John the Baptist is hesitant to baptize Jesus, Jesus insists on it, saying it's needed to fulfill all righteousness. The text we're looking at interprets that as the official, legal transfer of sin, a totally vital piece of the plan.
And this right here is the central argument of the whole text. The idea is that the power of the crucifixion is essentially unlocked by the baptism. From this viewpoint, without that first step of taking on sin, the crucifixion would have just been a tragic execution. It's the two events together that create the one complete, perfect, effective sacrifice.
So, after all that, what was the end result of this two-part sacrifice? Well, that brings us to the final outcome, the whole point of the plan: reconciliation between God and humanity, and the offer of salvation.
So what kind of impact did this sacrifice actually have? Well, the transformation described is just total. The relationship dynamic flips from being defined by hostility and judgment to one of peace and love.
According to this view, for anyone who believes, that wall of sin that caused the separation in the first place is just gone. So in practical terms, what does this actually mean for a believer? It means the debt is stamped, paid in full. God's justice has been completely satisfied, and that opens the door for salvation from judgment based on faith in this act. And all of that leads to the ultimate goal, the complete restoration of that relationship with God.
And the final piece that ties this whole theological argument together is found in Jesus' last words on the cross. When he says, "It is finished," the source doesn't see that as a cry of defeat or death, but as a declaration of victory. Mission accomplished. The entire intricate plan of atonement is now finally complete.
And so, that leaves us with a pretty deep question to think about. The framework we've just walked through presents this amazing model where divine justice demands a payment, but it's divine love that steps in to provide the payment itself. They aren't seen as opposing forces, but more like two sides of the very same coin. So the question becomes, how does a sacrificial offering like this change how we think about the relationship between justice and love? Thanks for tuning in.